From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states.
There was a turtle by the name of Bert, and Bert the turtle was very alert. When danger threatened him, he never got hurt. He knew just what to do.
First, you'll have to know what happens when an atomic bomb explodes. You'll know when it comes. We hope it never comes, but we must get ready. It looks something like this. There is a bright flash, brighter than the sun, brighter than anything you've ever seen. If you were not ready and did not know what to do, it could hurt you in different ways.
As the Cold War escalated in the years following World War II, two nations sat on edge, terrified that a nuclear war could erupt at any time. For the first time in history, the world feared an enemy that could destroy everything without warning. The Cold War was a conflict of differing cultures, Russian and American, communist and capitalist, Western and Eastern. Both world powers were desperate to demonstrate that their culture ranked superior, and yet, in April of 1958, just months after the USSR launched Sputnik, an event that was a terrifying jolt for the United States, a Texan from Fort Worth walked out of the Moscow Conservatory of Music as a Russian declared victor. The admiration the Russians had for this young musician was like nothing that had been experienced before, and this appreciation held the power to bridge a seemingly endless gap between the two opposing nations. In 1958, the USSR hosted the first quadrennial Tchaikovsky International Music Competition for young classical musicians. The competition was created with the goal of showcasing Russian superiority in the fine arts. Some of the best young classical pianists and violinists from around the world were brought to Moscow to compete. Among this elite group was Texan Cliburn, a 23-year-old pianist whose career was just beginning, but whose love for the piano began at the precursor of age 3. Cliburn was taught to play the piano by his mother as a young child. He later moved to New York to study piano at the Juilliard School of Music under Russian-trained pianist Rosina Levine. Cliburn became fascinated with Russian music, culture, and architecture. Because of this fascination, Cliburn had no difficulty in mastering the Tchaikovsky music that was a requirement for the international competition. As the competition neared, Cliburn was not considered a threat to the Russian competitors who had never heard his name. Because of this, it was a surprise when Cliburn astounded the judges in the first round of the competition. Many of the more accomplished musicians were able to bypass this round. As the competition progressed, the concert hall began to fill with more and more spectators. And why? So the people of Moscow could watch the tall American pianist who had quickly and surprisingly become the new talk of the town. However, worry began to arise as officials in Russia suspected that Cliburn was homosexual.
U.S. government officials were worried that something was going to happen because the Soviets considered homosexuality a crime, and in fact they even jailed some of their own pianists for it. And so there was great worry about this. But the funny thing is that the Soviet leaders were so enamored of Van that they had no intention of rocking the boat.
In just a few short days, Cliburn ascended from an unknown pianist to the most famous and admired American in the USSR. This was something the world had never experienced before, Russians setting aside their Cold War bias to cheer for an American.
I don't think anyone was ever treated the way he was treated by the Russians. They went totally nuts about him, about his playing, and about who he was as a person.
Cliburn played with a style that was far beyond that of his competition, and the Moscow crowds fell in love with his performances. Not even Lev Lysenko, the Russian who was previously the top pick for the competition, could compare. Not only did Cliburn play the best, he was able to shatter the bias that convinced other American competitors that they could never win. After a considerable debate, both political and musical, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev compromised, allowing the judges to cast their votes without bias or political pressure, saying, "Is he the best? Then give him the prize." In the final round of the competition, with an encore lasting 8 minutes, an American was victorious in a Soviet competition. In the height of the Cold War conflict, Van Cliburn won the first international Tchaikovsky competition. Not only did Cliburn win the competition, he became a cultural hero. Upon his return home, Cliburn was honored with a ticker tape parade down the streets of New York City, an honor that had never before been given to a musician, much less a classical pianist. He was also featured on the cover of Time magazine as the Texan who conquered Russia. He became known as the American Sputnik and was adored by both Russians and Americans alike.
And yes, they're very sincere as a people. As a matter of fact, I couldn't refrain from telling them that they're very much like Texans. If a Texan likes something, he'll tell you, and if he doesn't, he'll certainly let you know.
Van Cliburn became an unlikely cultural ambassador between two powerful nations at a critical time, assisting the United States and the USSR in reaching a cultural compromise. Citizens of the countries were able to experience the culture of the other while setting aside their differences. The opposing country, for the first time since the end of World War II, appeared more like a friendly face than a hostile one.
So what happened after that point was something like the world had never seen and likely will never see again, because it was beyond the classical music world. It went totally international. He became a household name, of course, in the U.S., definitely in Russia, and remains that in Russia.
In November of 1958, a dinner banquet in honor of Rildia B., Van Cliburn's mother, was held by the National Guild of Piano Teachers. At this event, the founder of the guild announced a $10,000 donation to be a prize in a new competition. This competition would bring classical musicians from around the world to Fort Worth, Texas, and it would be called the Van Cliburn International Piano Competition. Cliburn toured the US and Russia with his music, inspiring young musicians in both nations, playing for every US president from Truman to Obama. He also played for Russian leaders including Gorbachev, the Russian who brought about the end of European communism.
I think you know by my constancy how very deeply I love Russian people and your culture and your art. And you go with me always in my life. And it is for both my beloved president and for you that I'm so happy to do this. Thank you.
Van Cliburn passed away in February of 2013. However, he still lives on in the spirit of those whose hearts he opened to change. Van Cliburn is a reminder to the world that despite our differences, we can still appreciate our similarities and compromise on our cultural disparities.
There was an opening of exchanges, for example, cultural exchanges, and the idea that they would send people here and we would send people there. There was a little of that going on even before his appearance, but it really stepped up.
And we'll have, out of 30 competitors, we may have 15 countries represented from that. And they come together and they're all just in love with music. It doesn't matter where they come from or, what their experience was leading to this point.
This compromise is in constant and critical need in our world today as negative current events and hostile foreign policy dictate our views. We are fortunate that every 4 years, Fort Worth, Texas, becomes a cultural mixing pot for musicians, just as Moscow has. Beautiful music is something that everyone in every country can relate to, despite bias. The gift that Van Cliburn provided the world with was one of timeless relevance, the gift of peace and the gift of music.